The Nancy Weber case, when two psychics saw the same ghost, two mediums entered separately. Both described the same angry spirit. What they found in New Jersey changed how investigators saw the truth. Long before the term psychic detective became familiar to true crime audiences, there existed practitioners who quietly worked with law enforcement agencies on cases that defied conventional investigation. In New Jersey, during the early 1980s, one such practitioner had built a reputation solid enough that hardened detectives would occasionally pick up the phone and ask for her help. Nancy Weber was a psychic medium whose work locating missing persons and providing information on unsolved crimes had earned her something rare in her field, a professional respect from skeptics who had watched her produce results they could not easily dismiss. She was not theatrical, she was not famous, she was effective, and in 1983, something frightened her enough that she reached out for help from one of the few people she considered a peer. That person was Lorraine Warren. The situation involved a residence in northern New Jersey where violent deaths had stained the property's history across multiple decades. The current occupants were a family of three, a married couple in their 40s and their college-age son who had recently returned home from university. They were not seeking publicity. They were not seeking validation. They were seeking relief from circumstances that had rendered their home nearly unlivable. Nancy Weber had already conducted her own preliminary assessment of the property at the family's request, and what she perceived there disturbed her in ways that years of police work and countless investigations had not. She wanted a second opinion. She wanted corroboration. She trusted Lorraine Warren to provide both. The disturbances the family reported were escalating in both frequency and intensity. Objects moved without any identifiable cause. Doors that the family members locked from the inside would be discovered standing open minutes later with no one having touched them. The wife described being awakened 3 consecutive nights by the unmistakable sensation of a hand pressing firmly against her face, though when her eyes opened in the darkness, no one stood beside the bed. Her husband slept through these incidents. She began to dread the approach of evening. The son reported that his bedroom had become completely unusable. He described an atmosphere of concentrated dread so oppressive that he could not remain inside the room for more than a few minutes without feeling physically ill. He had abandoned the space entirely and was sleeping on the living room couch with every lamp in the room turned on, unwilling to face darkness in that house. Ed and Lorraine Warren reviewed the property's documented history through public records and interviews with previous residents and neighbors. 2 deaths emerged from that research with sufficient clarity to be considered confirmed. The first involved a man who had perished inside the house itself under circumstances that his surviving family members disputed, suggesting complications or contradictions in the official account that were never publicly resolved. The second death involved a woman who had passed away on the land years before the current structure was built, back when the property was undeveloped and served a different purpose. The details of her passing were fragmented, but the fact of it was documented. 2 deaths, separated by decades, bound to the same parcel of earth. The Warrens proposed a methodology for the investigation that Nancy Weber immediately understood and appreciated. Lorraine Warren and Nancy Weber would each conduct independent walkthroughs of the property without any communication between them about their perceptions until both assessments were complete. Ed Warren would document each woman's impressions separately, recording their statements in isolation before any comparison was made. This was not standard practice for most paranormal investigations in 1983. This was protocol designed to produce evidence that could withstand serious scrutiny. Both women agreed. The family gave permission. The investigation began. Lorraine Warren entered the home first. Ed accompanied her with recording equipment but did not speak or prompt her observations. She moved through the residence slowly, pausing in doorways, standing silently in the center of rooms, allowing her impressions to form without forcing them. In the main bedroom, she stopped. She described a male presence, angry and possessive, concentrated in that specific space. She described the energy as someone who had not accepted the transition from living to deceased, someone whose refusal to move beyond the physical world had curdled into resentment and rage directed at the current occupants. She identified a secondary energy beneath the primary presence, something older and fainter, tied not to the structure but to the land itself. Finally, she walked the exterior of the property and paused at the northeast corner, describing it as a location of particular psychic intensity. Ed Warren recorded every statement without commentary. Nancy Weber entered the home hours later, after Lorraine had departed and without any knowledge of what Lorraine had reported. Ed Warren followed the same protocol, observing and recording without interference. Nancy moved through the residence with the practiced focus of someone accustomed to filtering signal from noise in psychically active environments. In the main bedroom, she stopped. She described a male presence, angry and possessive, concentrated in that exact location. She described the entity as someone who had perished in the house against his will, who refused to accept what had happened, and whose fury toward the living occupants was intensifying into something that crossed the threshold from disturbing to dangerous. She noted a secondary energy, older and less defined, tied to the land rather than the building. She walked the property's perimeter and identified the northeast corner as a focal point of concentrated psychic activity. Ed Warren recorded every word. When the two accounts were compared, the degree of overlap was extraordinary. Both women had independently identified the same primary entity in the same location with the same emotional characteristics. Both had perceived the same secondary presence with the same qualities and the same connection to the land rather than the structure. Both had marked the same corner of the property as significant. Ed Warren, who had spent decades documenting paranormal claims and investigating countless cases where witnesses contradicted each other or changed their stories under scrutiny, considered this one of the most compelling examples of psychic corroboration he had ever recorded. Two experienced practitioners working in isolation had produced matching accounts of a location's paranormal content. The statistical probability of that occurring through coincidence or suggestion was vanishingly small. The wife's experience of the hand against her face was not an isolated incident. During a private interview with Lorraine Warren, the woman described weeks of escalating physical contact that she had initially dismissed as exceptionally vivid nightmares. She described sensations of being pushed, grabbed, and restrained. She described feeling weight on her chest and pressure on her limbs. Then the experiences began occurring while she was unquestionably awake, standing in daylight, fully conscious. She stopped dismissing them. She started being afraid. Nancy Weber described the primary entity as someone whose refusal to accept the reality of his own passing had twisted into something pathological. The possessive fury he directed at the living family was not simply the confusion of a disoriented spirit. It was aggression. It was territorial. It was escalating. Lorraine Warren agreed with the assessment and added an additional observation that troubled her. The older energy beneath, tied to the land itself, was not the source of the aggression, but it was acting as an amplifier. It was feeding the active entity without directing it, providing a reservoir of psychic energy that the angry presence was drawing upon to manifest more powerfully and more frequently. The situation was not stable, it was worsening. Ed Warren contacted a priest familiar with spiritual deliverance and the church's practices surrounding protection from inhuman and human spirits. The priest agreed to perform a blessing and prayer of protection over the home and its occupants. Nancy Weber was present during the ritual at Lorraine Warren's specific request. Her role was to provide real-time psychic feedback on what was occurring beyond the visible and audible elements of the ceremony, to report on whether the entity was responding and how. The family gathered in the main bedroom. The priest began. Nancy Weber reported that the male presence resisted strongly during the opening prayers. She described the resistance as palpable, a psychic pressure pushing back against the words being spoken and the intentions being directed into the space. The priest continued without pause. At a specific moment during the rite of blessing, Nancy Weber reported an abrupt change. The entity withdrew. She was careful with her language. She described it as a withdrawal rather than an expulsion. The presence retreated rather than being driven out. It chose to leave rather than be forced. Lorraine Warren, observing independently, corroborated the perception. Both women sensed the departure at the same moment. The atmosphere of the room changed. The priest completed the prayers. The ceremony concluded. The family reported that the transformation was immediate and total. The oppressive atmosphere that had saturated the house vanished. The physical intrusions ceased completely. The son moved back into his bedroom and slept through the night without incident. The wife experienced no further contact. Within a week, the family described their home as feeling, for the first time since they had moved in, like it genuinely belonged to them. The space was theirs again. The anger that had claimed it was gone. Ed Warren presented the Nancy Weber case at multiple university lectures throughout the mid-1980s, using it as a primary example in his arguments for the legitimacy of psychic perception as an investigative tool. He focused on the methodology, the independent corroboration, and the verifiable outcomes. He argued that when two experienced practitioners working in isolation produce matching accounts of a location's paranormal characteristics, the results deserve serious consideration from researchers willing to examine evidence without prejudice. The case strengthened the professional relationship between Lorraine Warren and Nancy Weber, who went on to collaborate on several additional investigations throughout the decade. Nancy Weber continued her work with law enforcement and became involved in several high-profile criminal cases in New Jersey that drew national media attention in the years that followed. Her reputation, already solid, became unshakable. The house in northern New Jersey remains privately owned. The family who experienced the disturbances lived there for years afterward without further incident. The case file remains in the Warren archives as one of the clearest documented examples of psychic corroboration in the field of paranormal investigation. Two practitioners, two independent assessments, one matching account. The Nancy Weber case stands as evidence that some perceptions, however difficult to measure or explain, produce results that cannot be easily dismissed by those willing to examine them honestly. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.